I remember the day I packed my last box, at 68 years old, thinking a nursing home would bring peace after years of living alone. The ads promised community, care, and ease, no more worrying about meals or maintenance. But as I settled in, a quiet regret settled with me. If you're in your 50s or beyond, pondering that move for security or simplicity, listen closely. I've learned 6 hard truths the brochures don't mention, truths that reshaped my golden years. They might just help you reflect on your own path before it's too late. Stay with me, this could change how you see your future. This video is for general educational and inspirational purposes only. Please reflect and consult professionals when applying life lessons. My name is Eleanor, a retired high school English teacher from a quiet suburb outside Cleveland, Ohio. At 68, I still moved with the same deliberate steps I'd used for decades, grading papers and tending my small backyard garden. My husband Robert had passed 10 years earlier, and though I kept our 2-story house tidy and the routines familiar, morning coffee on the porch, afternoon walks to the library, evenings with a book and a cup of chamomile, the silence had grown heavier each season. One winter evening I slipped on an icy step while carrying groceries. Nothing broken, just a bruised hip and a long night in the emergency room. My daughter Sarah flew in from Chicago, my son Michael drove up from Columbus, and both sat me down with gentle but firm concern. They spoke of my safety, of how hard it was for them to be so far away, of how a fall like that could happen again. They showed me brochures for Willow Grove Senior Living, a place 20 minutes from my old neighborhood. The photos showed bright dining rooms, cheerful activity calendars, staff in soft scrubs smiling beside residents playing cards or doing gentle chair yoga. It looked peaceful, almost inviting. They promised I wouldn't feel alone anymore. I listened, nodded, and after weeks of quiet debate with myself, I agreed. The real estate agent sold the house quickly. I sorted photo albums, gave away Robert's tools, packed the china I hadn't used in years, and chose which pieces of furniture could fit into the single room that would become mine. On moving day in early spring, the moving van pulled away and I rode in Sarah's car to Willow Grove feeling a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. The lobby smelled of lemon cleaner and faint lavender. A nurse named Carla welcomed me with a warm handshake and showed me to room 214. I set my favorite reading lamp on the nightstand, hung a watercolor of the lake we used to visit on the wall, and told myself this was sensible, practical, the responsible choice at my age. That first week passed in a gentle blur of introductions, orientation tours, and communal meals. I met neighbors who shared stories of teaching careers, military service, children scattered across the country. Over coffee in the sunroom we laughed about grandchildren's antics and swapped recipes we no longer cooked ourselves. For a moment it felt like the fresh chapter everyone had promised. Yet even then, in the background, something intangible began to shift, like the first faint creak in a familiar house you've lived in so long you stop noticing the sound until it grows louder. The core lesson arrived not in a single moment but as a slow, accumulating realization. Independence is far more than the ability to dress or cook alone. It is the quiet foundation of feeling fully alive, of owning your hours and choices in the later chapters of life. In the months after settling into Willow Grove, 6 hard truths revealed themselves, each one stripping away an illusion I hadn't even known I carried. The first was the steady erosion of privacy. My room had its own door, yet staff entered for routine checks with little more than a brief knock. Medications were delivered on their timetable, conversations drifted through thin walls. The simple act of closing my door to read in uninterrupted quiet or to sit with my thoughts became a small, daily negotiation. Second came the flattening of time by rigid schedules. Breakfast at 7:30, lunch at noon, bingo at 2, lights dimmed reminders by 9. The freedom to eat when hunger struck, to nap on a whim, to stay awake past midnight with a book, these vanished. Days merged into one long, predictable rhythm that dulled the edges of anticipation. Third was the brittle nature of the social ties formed there. We shared laughter over coffee, swapped stories of grandchildren and long-ago travels. Yet people left abruptly. Some regained strength and returned home, others slipped away forever. Each departure left an empty chair and a fresh reminder of impermanence. Fourth, the care itself, though competent and kind, often felt transactional. Aides were efficient, nurses attentive to charts and vitals, but the personal recognition that comes from long familiarity, the knowing glance, the unhurried conversation, was rare. I became a resident number more than a woman with a lifetime of stories. Fifth, the financial reality settled in quietly but persistently. The base rate had seemed reasonable, yet extras accumulated: premium cable, private laundry service, occasional off-site trips, even small fees for preferred seating in the dining room. Savings I thought would last began to erode faster than I'd calculated. Finally, the deepest truth: the subtle diminishing of self that accompanies lost autonomy. I found myself hesitating before making requests, apologizing for preferences, feeling like a polite visitor in my own existence rather than its rightful steward. That quiet surrender of agency weighed heavier than any physical limitation. These truths were not loud catastrophes. They were the soft, persistent reshaping of daily life, each one teaching me that preserving dignity and choice matters more than convenience ever could. These truths did not strike like thunder. They settled gradually, like dust on forgotten shelves, until one morning I woke realizing the woman who once planned spontaneous road trips and rearranged furniture on a whim now waited for permission to leave the building for an hour. I felt myself shrinking, not in body, but in presence. Conversations with my children became shorter, more careful. I answered their questions about how I was settling in, with practiced smiles instead of honest words. The spark that had carried me through 30 years of teaching restless teenagers, through raising 2 children mostly alone after Robert's illness, through grieving quietly while still showing up for others, that spark dimmed. I began to measure days by what was allowed rather than what I chose. Yet the very weight of that diminishment became its own teacher. I started small acts of reclamation, requesting my meals be brought to my room so I could eat while reading instead of in the noisy dining hall, asking to skip the scheduled movie night to walk the garden path alone at dusk, quietly insisting on keeping my door closed during afternoon rest hours without explanation. Each request felt like defiance at first, then like breathing again. Staff noticed. Some were accommodating, others gently reminded me of house rules. But the act of asking restored a piece of agency I hadn't known was missing. This shift rippled outward. I wrote longer letters to Sarah and Michael, describing not just the weather or the menu but the small joys I was fighting to keep. How the scent of rain through an open window still made me feel connected to the world beyond these walls. I shared stories from my classroom days with newer residents, not as nostalgia, but as proof that we remain more than our circumstances. Slowly, purpose returned, not in grand gestures, but in deliberate choices that honored the life I had built. If you find yourself in midlife or beyond, noticing how comfort has quietly replaced curiosity, how routines have softened the edges of your days, pause there. That awareness is a gift. It invites you to examine what still matters most, not flawless safety, but the freedom to shape your hours, to surprise yourself, to remain the author of your story even as the chapters lengthen. One memory that still surfaces clearly is of Margaret, the woman in room 212 whose door was always ajar. She had been a master gardener in her prime, her backyard once featured in the local paper for its cascading roses and herb spirals. At Willow Grove she kept a single African violet on her windowsill, fussing over it with the same tenderness she'd once given entire beds. Every morning she'd wheel herself to the sunroom, position the pot to catch the best light, and talk to it softly as if coaxing secrets from the soil. Yet the facility's rules were firm: no personal plants beyond one small pot, no access to outdoor beds, no tools sharper than a pair of rounded scissors. She couldn't prune, couldn't repot, couldn't even bring in fresh cuttings from the courtyard shrubs. The violet slowly declined despite her care, its leaves yellowing at the edges. Watching her stroke the fading petals, I saw my own longing mirrored back, how a single denied habit could hollow out the days. Another quiet echo came from late evenings when the building quieted. I would sit by my window with the lamp low, turning pages in a novel, only to hear the soft shuffle of aides making final rounds. At 10 o'clock sharp the hallway lights dimmed to a night glow, doors were checked, and a gentle voice would remind everyone it was rest time. I had spent 40 years deciding my own bedtime, sometimes reading until 2, sometimes drifting off at 8 after a long day. That small freedom, once unremarkable, now felt like a lost continent. I began keeping the book open under the covers with a tiny booklight, reading in secret like a teenager hiding from parents. The act was childish, yet it returned a sliver of control, a reminder that even in compromise, spirit finds ways to assert itself. These fragments, of a woman grieving her garden, of midnight pages turned in shadow, illustrated the same quiet truth. The things we once did without thinking often hold the deepest meaning, and when they slip away unnoticed, something essential dims with them. In the end, after nearly 2 years at Willow Grove, I made the decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. I left. Not in anger, not in dramatic rebellion, but with the calm clarity that comes when you finally name what you need most. My children were surprised, then supportive. We found a small one-story cottage 10 minutes from Sarah's old neighborhood. Nothing grand, just a place with wide doorways, a tiny patio where I could keep pots of herbs, and windows that let in morning light without anyone scheduling it. A part-time aide came 3 mornings a week to help with heavier tasks. The rest I handled myself, slowly, deliberately, savoring every small victory. The first night back in my own space I sat on the couch until well past midnight, reading by the lamp I'd rescued from storage, no one to dim the lights or check on me. I made tea at 3 in the morning because I wanted to, not because a cart was passing by. I planted basil and rosemary in clay pots on the patio and watched them grow unchecked. Simple acts, yet each one stitched a piece of me back together. Regret, I learned, is not always loud remorse. Sometimes it is the quiet ache of realizing you traded too much freedom for too little peace. But regret can also be a compass. It pointed me toward what still mattered, the right to choose my rhythm, to keep learning, to surprise myself even in these later years. I no longer measure my days by safety alone. I measure them by whether they feel like mine. If this story echoes anything in your own life, the way comfort can quietly crowd out vitality, the way small freedoms quietly sustain the spirit, pause and listen to that echo. Ask yourself what you are willing to protect, what small choices might still be within reach. The years ahead do not have to be smaller than the ones behind. They can be shaped, still, by the same steady hand that has carried you this far. Hit like if it sparked thought, subscribe to Prime Wellness for more stories on thriving in our later years. Thanks for listening.